A method for exegeting emotions in the Bible for higher quality translation. Before we dive into the presentation, let me lay some groundwork by sharing a bit of the story behind why this is even being presented. When I dove into the Bible as a teenager, I learned that God cares very much about emotions. We are to love God with all our heart, to have compassion on others, to be tender and kind-hearted to other believers. When offended, we're to forgive, control our anger, and pray as the psalmist did. The only thing we are to boast in, according to Jeremiah 9:24, is that we know God delights in loyal love and justice. Emotions occupy center stage in how God revealed himself and how he commands us to act. Let's fast forward some years. When I began serving as the Greek exegete for an oral Bible translation team, the Spoken English Bible, I found that we spent hours discussing the possible emotions of the characters in the text. Our conversations often came back to this one statement: none of the commentaries speak to this person's emotions, so we'll have to make our best guess. I got tired of guessing when it came to translating God's Word. So I searched everywhere for a theoretically grounded method for identifying and translating emotions. 2 years and about 200 articles later, I still haven't found one. So I've made my own. Think of the rest of this presentation like the framework for a building. The walls aren't in yet, but this structure is sturdy enough to build upon. So let's dive into the presentation. Emotions play a crucial role in human cognition and decision making. They influence how well we remember things and what we think someone means when they communicate. Emotions are so important for how humans think that they appear in every linguistic level, including phonology, morphology, syntax, discourse, and conceptual metaphors. Getting emotions right is essential for Bible translation quality. Bible translators have long recognized the importance of emotions. Leaders in translation theory have commented on its importance from Martin Luther to Mildred Larson. Even our highest governing body, the Forum of Bible Agencies International, FOBI, formally recognizes the importance of emotions in Bible translation. The second FOBI Bible translators are to communicate not only the informational content, but also the feelings and attitudes of the original text. The flavor and impact of the original should be re-expressed in forms that are consistent with normal usage in the language. Despite their essential role, Bible translators do not have adequate guidance to translate the emotions of the Bible well. Our classic textbooks on translation just scratch the surface of how emotions appear in language, and our translation commentaries do not systematically deal with emotions in the text. We'll discuss why this is the case shortly, but first we must come face to face with the enormity of this problem. It's a huge problem because most translations are intended to be heard or seen by their audiences, whether that be through public reading at church, live sign language or oral Bible translation performances, or recordings of such performances. Those who read the scriptures aloud must have cues to interpret the emotions in the biblical texts. All too often, those reading the text must guess the emotions in it. This presentation will highlight the main points of my paper. The paper introduces the study of emotions, then focuses on the interplay between emotions and society in forming meaning, and briefly surveys how emotions are expressed in every level of language. Building on these theoretical foundations, the paper introduces a simple process for identifying emotions in the biblical texts, and an example of this method applied to Mark 7:24 through 30. So, the first section. What we now call emotions have been studied in the West by philosophers since 500 BCE. The philosophical terms passions and affections became core to the theology of the Church Fathers and the medieval church, so the concept of emotion emerged as a scientific alternative in about the 1850s. However, linguists didn't thoroughly investigate emotions in language until the 1990s. From Martin Luther in the 15th century to Mildred Larson in the 20th century, Bible translators have been ahead of the curve in recognizing the importance of emotions. Until now, Bible translators have been hindered, though, by a lack of consensus on what emotions even are. So, emotions, sort of definitionless, but they're also a largely agreed upon term. Experts have had a hard time agreeing on a definition for emotions because emotions are really complex. Emotions have at least 6 prominent features. They include evaluations, physiological responses, conscious feelings, expressions, behaviors, and thoughts. So, folk and technical definitions, or in other words, emic and etic definitions of emotion, often differ in which features they most prominently account for. For example, some biologists focus on physiological responses in emotions. Some psychologists and their theories focus on thoughts and maybe feelings, while everyday people often focus on how they feel and how they express their emotions. Despite the varieties of definitions for emotion, the most influential theories agree upon 10 core aspects. I concisely describe these points of agreement in my paper, but for the sake of time, we'll not talk about them here. Volumes have been written on the interaction between emotion, cognition, and memory. Here are a few takeaways for you. 1. All prominent theories about emotions agree that they are integral to our cognitive processes. 2. Research shows that emotions are triggered as quickly as reflexes, which is crazy fast. Right. Emotions also control what we consider relevant in relevance theory terminology. Related to this, emotions signal our brain to remember events and to compare those events with others that had similar emotions. So, emotions also have tremendous control over our bodies. They take control of the hormones our bodies release, including the ones that govern how quickly our heart beats and whether we enter fight or flight mode. Emotions also can control the nervous system, including our muscles. Have you ever blushed or smiled without conscious control? It's because of your emotions. In short, there's no way to get around it. Emotions are just really important. So the third section of my paper discusses the intersection between emotion and society. It explains how cultures form emotions and what emotions signify within the cultures. I'm just going to hit the highlights in this part of the presentation. So emotions are biological adaptations shared among all humans, and as Mirget says, they're only accessible through the constructions they receive in different cultures. So cultures define who can display an emotion, when they can display that emotion, and how the emotion can be displayed. These rules are called cultural display rules, or CDRs for short. CDRs can significantly skew the emotions we find in texts. Emotions are important in every culture because they arise when events affect something we value. In fact, they form a bedrock for human moral judgments. The right emotion at the right time signals that the person has culturally appropriate values. There seem to be 4 primary factors that influence CDRs. The first 2 are identity and relationships. Identities arise from how a person fits within a community, and people gain multiple identities through their life. For example, a boy first learns he's a son, and then he eventually also becomes a man. And then possibly he gets married and he has the identity of a husband, and then a father. By that point in his life, he has the identity of son, man, husband, and father. People process events through the identities activated in a scenario. So they have emotions according to their most salient identity in the scenario. For example, a man will feel different if his dad interrupts him, his wife interrupts him, or his young daughter interrupts him. So Cultures also have different CDRs related to identities. For example, women in the United States are expected to express anger differently than men. There's a lot of research about that. CDRs can also differ according to the level of familiarity in a relationship. For example, we find this reflected linguistically, where there are languages that have formal and familiar pronouns. And it can be inappropriate to use the formal or the familiar in a particular scenario because of the cultural display rules and the emotions and the relationship things that are signaled through that. Now, earlier I said that emotions embody cultural values in action. Events embody cultural values in time. The locations in which events occur embody these values in space. So cultural display rules around spaces or locations often correspond to the events that typically happen in them. For example, Western funerals are traditionally somber, and so funeral homes are also somber places. Here are some translation implications. If cultural display rules differ between cultures, the translation may need to be adjusted. You can ask this question. Is the literal translation of a verse more intense in the receptor language than it was in the source? It may need to be tweaked to conform to the phobi expectation of the same flavor and impact. You can do this tweaking through connotations of some of the words that you choose, maybe through morphemes, as I'm going to discuss in the next section, or it could also be through a cultural footnote. This fourth section of the paper discusses the intersection between emotion and language, explaining the role of emotion in language, the role of language in emotion, and how emotion appears at every level of language. Again, in my presentation, I'm just going to hit the highlights. In 1921, Sapir stated that ideation reigns supreme in language, whereas emotions are but meagerly expressed. We now know that Sapir was wrong. Research shows that emotion appears at every level of language and plays a major role in communication. So when we're talking about language, it's important to differentiate from the outset that languages can both conceptualize, so by that we mean talk about, and express emotion. We'll flesh out the differences between these two as we look at how emotions appear in different levels of language, but it's good for you to note this from the outset. Now I will blitz through some of the examples I provide in the article for how emotions appear in language. On the next slide, I'll give some translation strategies. In phonology, we see that emotions appear in intonation contours. When intonation expresses a different emotion from the words, the human brain becomes unconsciously biased toward the meaning signaled through intonation. If someone growls out, "I love you," in a hateful tone, we'll believe they actually hate us. Researchers call this prosaic dominance. In morphology, emotions can be indicated through evaluative morphemes, like the diminutive or the augmentative. Cross-linguistically, diminutives can be used to express fondness, or that something is despised. The context determines what emotion is expressed with these evaluative morphemes. So, individual words can also be used to express emotion or to conceptualize them. So we can conceptualize our experience of an emotion by labeling it. So for example, labeling something anger. I can tell somebody, I used to be angry, and I can do that without expressing any level of anger. It's just conceptualizing or talking about it. So on the other hand, I can also express anger without ever naming it. I could express anger by calling somebody a negative word. So negative words are another way, or positive words. These words with connotations also have emotional freight. For example, if somebody's angry and they call someone else lazy, the word lazy has a negative connotation, while its synonym, inactive, doesn't. So next, syntax and speech acts. These are rich reservoirs of emotional expression. For example, exclamations like wow, or look, or aha. These are often used to indicate a level of energy and surprise or excitement. Now, in discourse, we can find other structural means of expressing emotion, such as dropping a quote formula to indicate heightened action or emotional intensity. Emphatic discourse structures often also highlight the most emotionally salient information. At the level of genre expectations, we find that cultures have CDRs, cultural display rules, depending upon the genre. For example, Koine Greek speakers were expected to start personal letters by discussing their affection for the recipients. We see this all the time in Paul's letters. Now, at the level of conceptual metaphor, we find that emotions often fit into certain conceptual metaphors. Cross-linguistically, languages conceptualize emotions as liquids and as impersonal forces. We find this in the Bible when it says that the love of God has been poured into our hearts, and when God says in the prophets that he will pour out his anger. Here are some basic translation principles for emotion in language. First, if an emotion appears in the biblical language at a level that it cannot in the receptor language, shift the emotion to a different level. For example, when Jesus tells a parable against the Jewish leadership in Luke 20, the leadership responds with the phrase, "Me genoito," which means, "may it never be." So the literal translation of the expression doesn't have the same emotional impact in English or many other languages. So translators can remedy this by describing the emotion behind the statement. So the NLT does this by saying that the Jewish leaders protested. The same thing could be accomplished in other languages using evaluative morphemes, discourse particles, or syntactic constructions. In an oral Bible translation, it could be used with intonation. So next, our emotions are deeply tied to our physical experiences. Figurative language is inherently more emotive because it is more concrete. Brain scans show that people react more strongly to statements like, "she looked at him sweetly," than they do with more abstract ones like, "she looked at him kindly." Now, these brain scans show that the brain lights up more with the use of sweet because areas that are associated to food are actually activated as it's processing the language. Demetaphorizing passages removes their emotional flavor. And now we are finally at the method that I've proposed. This section provides a framework for when to apply the knowledge in the previous sections and how to synthesize that information into a form people intuitively grasp. First, the goal of emotion exegesis is an appropriate range of emotion. We don't have access to the exact emotions people had, nor do we normally communicate about emotions with laser-like precision. For example, with the statement, "may it never be," we can say with confidence that they weren't in a particular state of vigilance, ecstasy, admiration, or any type of positive amazement. So this leaves anger, loathing, grief, or terror. These emotions also fit with what the Jewish leadership do next in the story, which is plot to kill Jesus and be afraid of the crowds. So here's my method. I suggest that translators first gain a sense of empathy for the characters in the passage. This empathy serves as a foundation for the next two steps. And these next two steps happen iteratively, so I've made them 2, 3 in the diagram. So they need to reconstruct the context for the emotions, and then they need to use accurate cultural categories of the emotion. The translators will need to keep bouncing back and forth between steps 2 and 3 until they can do the fourth step, which is create an accurate, emotionally compelling backstory for the passage. This backstory should explain the possible range of emotions for each character in the passage. So we need to start by developing empathy because just like analytical skills are foundational for grammatical analysis, emotional intelligence is foundational for emotion exegesis. Here are some science-backed methods, or rather one science-backed method, for rapidly increasing your emotion with characters in the text. Mimic what you imagine they were doing. Because our emotions are actually really tied to physical experiences, the more senses you engage with, the more you empathize. So mimic the body language you imagine the characters had. Studies show that mimicking body language increases our ability to understand the emotions that other people have. So, reconstructing the context of the passage. Emotions occur in immediate contexts, which are the events, and these events are situated in broader contexts, which are the social norms and the recent big events in the culture. We need to look at the immediate and the broad context for 6 categories. I'm going to just briefly list these categories here. The chart I provide for them in the paper is very useful, but we'd run out of time if I shared it. So first, frame of mind. Next, relationships. Third, expectations of the event. Fourth, influence of location. Fifth, default response to the emotions. And sixth, foundational values. Now we're at the third step I suggest, using accurate cultural categories for the emotions in the text. This is by far the hardest step. It's like learning to see new colors or hear new phonemes. What makes it even harder is that we can't test our ideas with cultural insiders because they're all dead. So until scholarship catches up in this area, I think the fastest way we can familiarize ourselves with the cultural categories for emotion in the Bible is to read. I think that we need to read dictionaries organized by semantic domain. If you think that someone in the text is afraid, look up different words they had for fear and the connotations of those words. Things like the Loneida for Greek or the SDBH for Hebrew are very useful for this. This brings us to the final step, making an emotionally compelling backstory. After reconstructing the context and determining the appropriate emotion categories, we can stitch together a backstory. Now, exegetical advisors can make a backstory to share with the team beforehand and share it during a devotional time. Or they can help the team make a backstory as a preparatory step for translating. I suggest fleshing out the emotions in the text this way, because if the team is involved, they'll develop more empathy, and they'll also reveal cultural insights into the passage and cultural misconceptions or barriers. And the earlier both of these come up, the better. Here's an example of an emotionally compelling backstory from a short but notoriously tricky episode in Mark. Jesus traveled to the region of Tyre, a famous port city on an island. Israelites had a long, fraught history with Tyre. Israel's prophets denounced it for many things and said that God would judge it. And God did. Several hundred years before the time of Jesus, Alexander the Great cut down the forest on the mainland, built a bridge to the island of Tyre, and completely destroyed the proud city. Now, when Jesus got to Tyre and went in the house he wanted to stay in, he did not want anybody to know that he was there. But one woman, born in that region, heard about Jesus. She desperately hoped that he would cast the demon out of her daughter. She went to Jesus, fell down on the floor in front of him, and repeatedly begged that he would cast out the demon. Now, Jesus wasn't serving any of the Jewish people then, whom he was sent to serve first. How could he perform miracles for a non-Jewish person, especially someone from Tyre? First, Jesus said, let the children eat all they want, because it's not good to take bread from the children and throw it to the little dogs. Now, this woman had heard about some of the miracles that Jesus had performed. Even as Jesus spoke, she thought of the dozens or even hundreds of demons he had driven out of people. It didn't matter that Jesus called her a dog. He could rescue her daughter. Lord, she responded, even the little dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Oh, few people had demonstrated such tenacious, moving faith. How could Jesus say no to someone who trusted him so much? Jesus said to her, "Because of what you've said, go on your way. The demon has gone out of your daughter." The woman went home. Her daughter was lying on her bed, and the demon was gone. We can only imagine what that woman felt and how her faith grew. The end. Well, I look forward to interacting with your responses, and now it's your turn. For my references, you can see my article in the book, and if you would like to connect with me further, please email me.